The wealthiest duke chose the sister nobody wanted. What happened next shocked the kingdom. The carriage arrived without warning. That was the first strange thing. No letter had come ahead of it. No footman on horseback. No advance notice of any kind. One moment the gravel drive of the Marchetti estate was empty, pale and quiet under a gray November sky, and the next moment there were wheels on the stones and the sound of horses breathing hard from a long ride. The house had not been prepared. The silver on the sideboard was borrowed from a neighbor and had not yet been polished. The flowers in the entrance hall were 2 days old. Clara Marchetti, standing at the top of the stairs when the housekeeper came to tell her, felt her stomach drop straight to the floor. "Which carriage?" she said. Though she already knew, there was only one family in the entire province who traveled with 4 horses and a crest on the door. The Duke of Valoria had arrived. Clara moved fast. She was not a woman who panicked openly. She had been raised in a house where panic was kept behind closed doors, and a calm face was considered as important as a good name. She sent the housekeeper to alert Alessia first, then turned and walked quickly down the corridor toward the back of the house where she already knew, with a certainty that sat in her chest like a stone, that she would find Mara. Mara was exactly where Clara expected her to be. She was sitting at the old writing desk in the small room beside the kitchen, the room no one else used because the window faced the wrong direction and the fireplace smoked, with a book open in front of her and ink on the fingers of her right hand. She was 26 years old, and she looked nothing like a woman who had been waiting for anything. That was the thing about Mara. She never looked like she was waiting. "The Duke is here," Clara said. Mara looked up. She did not look alarmed. She looked faintly annoyed, which was somehow worse. "Which Duke?" "Do not do that," Clara said. "You know which one. Edoardo Conti. He is in the drive right now and his man is already at the door. Your sister is getting dressed. I need you to go upstairs and—" "And what?" Mara said. She had already closed the book. Not quickly, not reluctantly, just closed it, the way someone closes something they intend to return to. "Alessia is the one he's come to see. I don't need to be there for that." "You need to be presentable," Clara said, and hated the word the moment it left her mouth, because she saw what it did to Mara's face. Not hurt, something flatter than hurt. Something that had been hurt so many times it had learned to stay still. Mara stood up. She was taller than her mother remembered her being, or perhaps it was just the way she held herself, straight, unhurried, entirely uninterested in performing anything for anyone. She looked down at her ink-stained fingers, then looked back at her mother. "I'll wash my hands," she said. "That's all I'm promising." The drawing room was not a disaster, which was the most that could be said for it. The curtains were the good ones, the blue silk ones that Clara kept wrapped in cloth and brought out only for occasions. The chairs had been dusted. The maid had put fresh wood on the fire. Alessia was already there when Mara came in, and the sight of her younger sister was the thing that always made Mara feel whatever was left of her composure, stretched thin and tight like old fabric pulled too far. Alessia was beautiful. This was not a complicated thing to say, and it was not unkind. It was simply true, the way the weather was true. She had their father's coloring, dark eyes, thick hair the color of polished wood, and their mother's instinct for the exact right way to stand, to turn, to let light fall on her face. She was wearing the cream dress that Clara had pressed 3 times in 2 days in case this exact moment arrived, and she wore it with the unconscious ease of someone who had been told, their whole life, that rooms were built for people like her to walk into. Mara sat down near the window. She had washed her hands. There was still a faint shadow of ink at the base of her left thumb that she had not managed to remove, and she folded her hands in her lap so the ink faced down. Edoardo Conti came in 3 minutes later. He was not what the stories described. Mara had heard enough about the Duke of Valoria over the years to have built a picture, and the picture was of a man who knew exactly what he was worth, and wore that knowledge like a second coat. The stories mentioned his wealth, the estates, the city house, the investments that had made his family the richest in 3 provinces. The stories mentioned his first wife, who had died 4 years ago, and the son she had left behind. The stories mentioned that he was 38 and had not shown interest in anyone since the funeral, and that half the families in the kingdom had been positioning their daughters carefully ever since. The man who walked into the Marchetti drawing room was none of the stories. He was tall, yes. Well-dressed, yes. But there was nothing about him that seemed to care whether you noticed. He walked in the way that men walk when they have stopped trying to be impressive and have simply become themselves, and the result was a quietness that filled the room differently than noise ever could. He greeted Clara first, which was correct. He greeted Alessia, and Mara watched his face while he did and saw nothing she could name. Not coldness, not calculation, not the focused attention of a man being shown something he had already decided he wanted. He was polite. He was perfectly pleasant, and then his eyes moved across the room, and they stopped. They stopped on Mara. She felt it before she understood it, the way you feel a change in the weather before you can see the clouds. She kept her hands folded and her face still and looked back at him with the same expression she had given every difficult thing in her life, steady, unreadable, giving nothing away for free. He crossed the room, not quickly, not with any kind of declaration. He simply walked toward her the way a person walks toward the thing they came to find. "You must be the elder Miss Marchetti," he said. "I am," Mara said. He did not look at her the way men usually looked at her, which was to say he did not look past her. He looked directly at her face, at her hands for just a moment, at the book-shaped line her fingers still remembered holding. "What were you reading?" he said. The room went very still. Clara's breath, somewhere behind Mara, became inaudible. Alessia stopped moving. Mara looked at him for a long moment. She was deciding something. Later she would not be able to say exactly what, only that she decided it. "History," she said. "The fall of a provincial government in the Eastern Territories, 2 centuries ago. It collapsed because the men in charge spent so much energy protecting their positions that they forgot to govern." Something happened in Eduardo Conti's face. It was not a smile. It was something smaller than a smile and more interesting than one. "And how did it end?" he said. "Badly for everyone," Mara said, "as these things generally do." He laughed. It was a real laugh, short and unperformed, the kind that escapes before a person decides whether to let it. Clara made a sound that was not quite words but communicated everything she needed to communicate, and Eduardo turned and was polite to everyone for the next 40 minutes. He drank tea. He spoke with Alessia, who was perfectly lovely, who said all the right things in all the right ways. He spoke with Clara about the estate and the province and the weather. He was attentive and correct and everything a visiting duke was supposed to be. But twice more, during those 40 minutes, his eyes came back to the window where Mara sat, and both times they found her already watching him, and both times, neither of them looked away first. He left as the light was going. His man had the carriage brought around, and Eduardo stood in the entrance and took his leave with all the proper forms. Clara was already calculating in her head which room would need to be redone before the next visit, how quickly she could get the silver properly polished, whether Alessia's best dress needed taking in at the waist. And then Eduardo's man handed Clara a folded note, and Eduardo was already walking back to his carriage, and Clara opened the note right there in the entrance hall with the cold air coming in from the open door. She read it once. Then she read it again. In the note requested, in formal and correct language, permission to call upon the estate, with the intention of paying his attentions to the elder Miss Marchetti. The elder, the request was clear. The phrasing was entirely proper. Mara, the note was about Mara. Clara stood holding it while the sound of the carriage wheels faded down the drive. Behind her, she could hear the maid moving in the drawing room, collecting the tea things. She could hear Alessia at the top of the stairs, asking what the note said, her voice light and certain, already expecting a particular answer. Clara stood in the cold entrance hall and held the note and did not know how long she stood there before Mara's voice came from the direction of the kitchen corridor. "Mother," Mara said, "close the door, you're letting the cold in." Clara looked up. Mara was standing at the far end of the hall, still perfectly composed, still giving nothing away. "He asked for you," Clara said. The words came out flat and strange, as if she were reading them from the wrong page. Mara looked at her. Then she looked at the note. Then she looked away, toward the window, and what passed over her face in that moment was something Clara had never managed to read in 26 years of trying. "Of course he did," Mara said quietly, and she did not sound pleased or frightened or hopeful. She sounded, more than anything, tired in the particular way of someone bracing themselves for something they have not chosen and do not yet know whether to trust. She turned and walked back toward the kitchen corridor. The door was still open. The cold was still coming in. Clara closed it. The gossip moved faster than the carriage had. By the time Eduardo Conti was halfway back to his estate, the house servants had told the cook had told the butcher's boy who delivered on Thursdays, and by Friday morning the 3 families nearest the Marchetti estate knew that the Duke of Valoria had come calling and left with something no one had predicted. It spread from there the way all extraordinary news spreads in a small province, not in one rush but in careful stages, each person passing it along with the particular pleasure of someone delivering a surprise they did not create but are glad to carry. The eldest Marchetti girl, the one who never came out, the one who sat in back rooms and read books and had ink on her fingers and had never, in anyone's recent memory, been put forward for anything. The story changed a little with each person who told it. By the time it reached the nearest town, it had grown a detail it did not originally have, that Mara had somehow arranged it, had done something clever or calculating to redirect the Duke's attention from Alessia to herself. This version of the story required Mara to have done something active and visible, because people find it easier to understand a thing they can imagine someone doing on purpose than a thing that simply happened. The simpler truth, that Eduardo Conti had walked into a room, looked at the woman everyone had forgotten to look at, and looked again, was somehow harder to believe. Mara heard all of it. She heard it from the housekeeper, who reported it with the careful neutrality of someone who had worked for the Marchetti family long enough to know that the correct expression in difficult moments was no expression at all. She heard it from the one friend she had kept through the years of quiet withdrawal, a woman named Philippa who lived 2 miles away and had always had the honesty to say plainly what others only suggested. "They're saying you tricked him," Philippa said, sitting across from Mara at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a cup of tea. She said it the way you say something to a person who deserves to hear the actual words rather than a softened version. "I know," Mara said. "And you don't care?" "I care," Mara said. "I'm just not sure what I'm supposed to do about it. Go out and explain to the province that I sat by a window and answered a question honestly, and that is apparently all it took? They'd find something suspicious about that too." Philippa looked at her over the rim of the cup. "Do you want this, truly?" Mara was quiet for a moment. It was the kind of quiet that was not evasion but actual thought, the pause of someone who does not give answers before the answer is ready. "I don't know what this is yet," she said finally. "He came once. He asked one question. That's all I know about Eduardo Conti." "You know his income," Philippa said. "Everyone knows his income," Mara said. "That doesn't tell you anything about who a person is at 7 in the morning before they've decided what to be for the day." Philippa set down her cup. "That is a very strange thing to say about someone you've spoken to for approximately 45 minutes. "It's the only thing that matters," Mara said, "and I learned it the hard way. So yes, I'll see what he is at 7 in the morning before I decide anything." She spoke with more certainty than she felt. The truth, which she would not have said to Philippa or her mother or anyone, was that something about the previous afternoon sat in her chest at an odd angle. Not the attention. She had received attention before, though not in recent years, not since the engagement that everyone politely never mentioned had ended, and she had retreated from society, with the quiet determination of someone removing themselves from a game they had decided not to play. The strange part was that he had looked at her hands. Not dismissively, not with the slight frown that people gave ink-stained hands when what they expected was jewelry. He had looked at them the way a person looks at something that tells them what they wanted to know. And then he had asked what she was reading. And he had asked how it ended, and when she had answered him honestly, he had laughed. A real laugh, unguarded, the kind you can't manufacture. And something about that unguarded laugh had been more unsettling than all the wealth and all the stories and all the province's sudden breathless interest in her future. She was afraid of it. She was honest enough with herself to say that. She was afraid of the thing that had no name yet, the thing that felt like the beginning of trusting someone, which had always ended badly. Eduardo called again the following Tuesday. He came in the afternoon with his man and without the formality of the previous visit. No carriage horses, just 2 riding horses, and he arrived looking like someone who had been working all morning and had ridden over in the space between one task and the next. Clara received him in the drawing room and did her best to manage the fact that Alessia was also present, sitting very correctly with her embroidery, which she had not looked at once in 20 minutes. Eduardo was polite to everyone, and then he asked, with the same directness that had unnerved Mara the first time and was beginning to seem like simply the way he spoke, whether Miss Marchetti might walk in the garden. "The light is good today," he said, "and I suspect she would rather be outside than in." Clara hesitated. The hesitation lasted exactly as long as it needed to before she calculated that a duke asking to walk in the garden was not an unusual request, and that the garden was visible from the drawing-room windows, and that she had very little ground on which to refuse. "Of course," she said, in the voice she used when she was agreeing to something she had not yet decided how to feel about. Mara came. She had been in the back room again, and she came into the drawing room still carrying the folder of papers she had been working on, a translation she had been doing for a friend who taught at the small school in town, and she set them down on the side table with the deliberate care of someone who intends to return to them soon and is making no pretense otherwise. They walked in the garden, which was November bare and gray and not beautiful in any conventional way. The roses were cut back to the wood. The hedges had been trimmed unevenly. There was a bench near the far wall that had been there long enough to have moss on the legs, and they reached it and stood near it, because neither of them had suggested sitting. Eduardo spoke first. "I want to be direct with you," he said. I noticed that about you, Mara said. He looked at her, and something in his face opened slightly. Is that a problem? No, she said. It's strange. Most people aren't. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the bare rose canes. I was married before, he said. You know this, I'm sure. The whole province knows, Mara said. Your wife died 4 years ago. You have a son who is 11. People say the marriage was a good one. People say that about most marriages that end before they have time to go wrong, Eduardo said. It was a flat statement, not cruel, not dramatic, just honest, in the way of someone who has spent 4 years deciding how to describe something accurately. It was a correct marriage. We were correct to each other. I don't know that it was good, exactly. I know that when she died I missed her, and I also understood, for the first time, how much of our life together had been performance. How much of what I thought was intimacy was actually two people doing a very good job of being seen together. Mara said nothing. She was looking at the moss on the bench legs. I don't want that again, he said. I have enough performance in my professional life. When I come home, I want to come home to something real, even if real is inconvenient. Even if real means disagreement and silence, and someone telling me plainly when I'm wrong. That sounds like a very specific thing to want, Mara said. It is, he said. I've had 4 years to get specific. She looked at him then, directly, the way she had looked at him the first day in the drawing room. And you think I'm that, she said, based on a conversation about a book. And the way you came into the drawing room yesterday with papers you didn't put down until the last moment because you weren't finished with them, he said. And the way you sat by the window instead of at the center of the room. And the way you answered my question with an answer that was inconvenient to give, and gave it anyway. Mara breathed out slowly. The cold air made it visible. You're describing someone who doesn't care what you think of her, she said. No, he said. I'm describing someone who cares about other things more. The wind moved through the garden. Somewhere in the house, a window opened and someone shook out a cloth, and the sound came to them distantly, domestic and ordinary. I'm not what this province expects a duke to choose, Mara said. I'm aware of that. I've been aware of it my whole life. I know, he said. That's not my concern. It will become your concern, she said. When people talk. When they find reasons to talk. When they dig up the engagement that didn't happen, and the years I didn't appear in public, and the fact that I have opinions about provincial governance that most people find uncomfortable. Let them talk, he said. That is very easy to say, she said. When it is your name they're finding reasons to question, and not your own. He was quiet. She had landed something true, and he was sitting with it. And she noticed that he did not flinch from it, or rush to argue. He sat with it. You're right, he said after a moment. It is easier for me. I won't pretend otherwise. Mara looked at him. The wind moved again. My younger sister is very beautiful, she said, and she is genuinely kind. She would make a correct duchess. She would know every rule and follow every one, and give you no trouble at all. I know, Eduardo said. Then why? Mara said, and the word came out smaller than she intended, more honest than she meant to be, carrying a weight she had not planned to put down in front of a man she had spoken to twice. He turned and looked at her with the same directness he had used from the very first moment. Because I walked into that room and you were the only person in it who wasn't trying to be anything, he said, and I have been so tired, for so long, of rooms full of people trying. Mara looked away, toward the bare garden, the gray sky, the moss-covered bench that had been there longer than either of them. Inside the drawing room she could see, through the glass, the faint shape of her mother standing to one side, watching, trying to look as though she was not watching. She stood in the cold November garden and felt the thing in her chest that she had been afraid of since the first afternoon shift slightly, the way something shifts when a door that has been closed a long time is opened just enough to let in light. Not all the way open, just enough. I'm not easy to know, she said. It was a warning, and she meant it as one. I'm not looking for easy, he said. The garden was quiet around them. The bare roses said nothing. The moss held its place on the bench. 1 month, Mara said at last. Come when you want. Say what you actually think. I'll do the same, and at the end of a month we'll both know enough to decide something. That's fair, he said. It's practical, she said, correcting him, because she would not let the word fair sit there unchallenged when practical was what she meant. He almost smiled. She was beginning to be able to read the small things near his mouth that happened just before he almost smiled. Practical then, he said. They walked back to the house. At the drawing room door, Mara picked up her papers from the side table without ceremony. tucked them under her arm, and excused herself, and she did not look back. In the drawing room, her mother stood very still, watching the door close behind her. Alessia set down the embroidery she had not been doing and looked at Eduardo with the particular expression of someone who has just watched a game they expected to be in played without them. She did not say anything. She was, as always, too well trained to say anything. But her hands in her lap were very still. And Eduardo, sitting back down to finish the tea that Clara quickly offered him, looked at the closed door for a moment with the expression of a man who has found what he came looking for and is already thinking about how not to lose it. The letter arrived on a Wednesday morning, tucked between an invoice from the coal merchant and a note from the church about the winter collection. Mara almost missed it. It was thin, folded twice, sealed with plain wax that had no stamp. Her name was written on the front in handwriting that was deliberate in a way that suggested disguise, the letters shaped with unusual care, as though someone had worked to make them look like no one's in particular. She held it for a moment before she opened it, running her thumb over the seal in the way you handle something you know is not going to be a pleasant delivery. She was right. The letter said, in plain, simple sentences, that she was making a mistake, that the Duke's interest was not what it appeared, that a man of Eduardo Conti's standing did not choose an overlooked woman from a declining family without reason, and that the reason was not affection. It said further that there were things about Mara's past, the engagement, the years away from society, the questions that had never been fully answered, that would surface publicly if this courtship continued. It said this not as a threat, precisely, but as a warning. A warning that was dressed so carefully in the language of concern that it took Mara 2 full readings to feel the shape of the blade inside it. She sat with the letter for a long time, then she folded it back the way it had come, put it in the drawer of the writing desk, and went about her morning. She did not tell her mother. She did not tell Philippa. She sat with it alone, the way she sat with most things, because she had learned years ago that the first thing you feel about a problem is rarely the most useful thing, and that the useful thing usually came later, when the first feeling had quieted enough for clear thought to move through. Eduardo came the following Friday. He had been coming 3 times a week since the garden conversation, and the visits had settled into a rhythm that was nothing like what Mara had expected a courtship to be. There were no performances. He came in the afternoon, sat in whatever room Mara happened to be in, which was often the back room with the smoking fireplace, because by the 3rd week he had stopped waiting to be shown to the drawing room, and started simply following the housekeeper toward wherever the work was. And they talked. They talked the way people talk when they have stopped trying to impress each other. About the history she was reading, about the governance problems in the Eastern Territories that she found so interesting, about the estate decisions he was dealing with and the council meetings that frustrated him, about his son Oliver, who was 11 and liked horses and was, in Eduardo's careful description, a child who would have benefited from more time with both his parents, and had instead received less of both than he deserved. "You blame yourself for that," Mara said one afternoon. "Yes," Eduardo said without hesitation. "Does knowing that change anything?" "It changes what I do now," he said. "It doesn't change what happened. I've stopped hoping it would." Mara had looked at him then with the particular attention she gave things that surprised her. Not many things surprised her. The readiness to say, "Yes, I was wrong," and the world did not rearrange itself to make it less so. That was rarer than income, rarer than good looks, rarer than almost everything the world spent its time chasing. She had not told him about the letter. She told him on the Friday of the 3rd week. She took it out of the drawer and she put it on the table between them, without preface or ceremony. He read it. He read it once and then a second time, the way she had. His face while he read it was very still. "Do you know who sent it?" he said. "Not yet," she said. "But I think it came from inside this house." The silence that followed that sentence was a specific kind. The kind that happens when something true is said that changes the shape of a room. "What makes you think that?" he said. "The timing," she said. "The details it used. The things it referenced were not public knowledge. Someone who knows this family and knows what has been discussed." "Then who?" he said. Mara pressed her hands flat on the table and looked at the letter between them. "I don't know yet," she said, "but I want you to know that it exists before I find out, because when I find out, it may involve people I care about. And I didn't want to handle it quietly in a way that you couldn't see." Eduardo looked at her. The afternoon light was flat and gray, coming in through the small window, the kind of November light that does not flatter anything and shows everything as it actually is. "Why are you telling me this?" he said. "You could have dealt with it yourself. I would never have known." "Yes," she said. "That's exactly why." He understood what she meant. She saw it happen in his face. "You're checking me," he said. It was not an accusation. I'm giving you information I have and you don't, she said. That's what trust looks like in the beginning, before you know whether the other person is going to hold it properly. And if I don't? He said. Then I know, she said, and I'm no worse off than I was, except that I've learned something useful. He was quiet for a long moment, and then he reached across the table and, not dramatically, not with any kind of romantic declaration, he put one hand over her hands where they lay flat on the table. Not grasping, not holding, just there. A weight, a presence, the simplest possible thing. I'm going to hold it properly, he said. Mara looked at his hand on hers. She did not pull away. She also did not move toward him. We'll see, she said. And she meant it. The source of the letter was found 11 days later, and the finding of it was the thing that Mara had feared most of all, because she had already suspected it and spent 11 days hoping she was wrong. It was not her mother. It was not a servant. It was not a rival family or a jealous acquaintance or any of the shapes that an anonymous letter could reasonably come from. The handwriting, when she finally compared it, carefully, over a full afternoon, holding the letter next to every piece of writing she could find in the house, was Alessia's. Mara sat alone with this knowledge for a very long time. She understood it. That was the worst part. She understood it completely. The way you understand something that explains everything and excuses nothing. Alessia had been positioned for this her whole life. Every dress, every lesson, every carefully managed appearance in front of the right people. All of it aimed at exactly the kind of future that had walked up the drive in a carriage with 4 horses and a crest on the door. And then the door had opened and the future had walked past her without stopping, and had gone to the back room where no one expected to find anything worth finding, and had asked about a book. Mara did not feel anger first. She felt grief first. A short, clean grief, for the version of her relationship with her sister that this letter made impossible to pretend was still intact. And then, slowly, the anger came. Not hot and wild, cold and familiar. The anger she had always been able to use the way a carpenter uses a level, to find out what was straight. She went to Alessia's room. Alessia was there. She looked up when Mara came in, and she did not pretend. That at least was something. Alessia had always been trained to performance, but she had never, in private, been able to perform with Mara. They had grown up too close for that. You found it, Alessia said. Yes, Mara said. The room was quiet. A clock somewhere in the hall measured the silence. I'm not going to pretend I don't understand, Mara said. I do. I understand exactly why you did it, and I understand how it felt. And I'm not going to stand here and make you feel small for wanting the life you've been told since you were a child was yours to want. Alessia's eyes were bright and too full, and she held herself very straight. But, Mara continued, you tried to use my past against me. The engagement, the years away, the questions people still ask. You packaged up the hardest things I ever survived, and you tried to send them to him as weapons. I was afraid, Alessia said, and the words came out smaller than she intended them to. Mara, I have nothing else. You have your books and your work and your ideas, and you have never needed what I need. And he walked in, and he looked at you, and I didn't know what else to do. Mara looked at her sister for a long moment, and the cold anger held its level. It did not soften, but it also did not boil over. You could have talked to me, Mara said. You wouldn't have stepped aside, Alessia said. No, Mara said, I wouldn't have, but I would have listened. And I would have told you the truth instead of letting you build your whole life on a performance, which is exactly what you've been doing, and exactly what is going to break you eventually, the way it breaks everyone. She crossed the room and she sat down across from her sister, and the two of them sat in the quiet room with everything they had not said to each other for years lying between them, heavy and necessary. What are you going to do? Alessia said. Are you going to tell him? Yes, Mara said. Alessia closed her eyes briefly. Will he tell Mother? I'm going to tell him everything, Mara said, because I told him from the beginning that I would. And that is the difference, Alessia, between the way I do things and the way you were taught to do them. I don't manage information. I give it and I let people decide. That's a very easy principle to have, Alessia said quietly, when you're not afraid of what people will decide. The words landed. Mara let them. You're right, she said after a moment. It is easier for people who have stopped expecting to be chosen, I'll give you that. They sat for a while longer without resolving anything, because the things between them were not the kind that resolve in a single room in a single afternoon. They were the kind that change slowly, over time, if both people are willing. Mara told Eduardo that evening. She told him everything, the letter, the handwriting, the conversation with Alessia, the grief that came before the anger, and the anger that came after. She told him with the same flat honesty she had brought to everything, watching his face while she did and looking for the things she was afraid of: blame, withdrawal, the sense that she came attached to too much difficulty. She did not find it. What she found was a man who listened without interrupting, and then was quiet for a long time and then said, "Your sister is terrified. That's not an excuse, but it explains a great deal." "I know," Mara said. "What do you need from me?" he said. The question stopped her. It was so simple and so unusual. What do you need was not what people asked. People asked, what do you want, which was decorative, or what do you intend, which was practical. But what do you need from me, said directly and meaning it. That was the question of someone who understood that being chosen came with a responsibility attached. She looked at him across the room, the November light fading around them. "Time," she said. "I need time to find out whether my sister is all right, and I need you to not make decisions about this before I've had that time." "Done," he said. And then, after a pause, "I'm also going to ask you something." "Go ahead," she said. "Does what she did change what you want?" he said. "Not what you think is right or what you plan to do, what you actually want." She was very still. "No," she said, after a long moment. "Good," he said. And in the quiet room, with the gray sky outside and the fire burning low and the letter folded in her pocket like a thing she had already finished with, something in Mara Marchetti's chest moved another degree toward open. Not all the way, but enough. The engagement was announced by the end of the month, in the correct formal language, in the provincial paper, and in a note sent to the families who needed to know. It said, simply and without ceremony, that Eduardo Conti, Duke of Valoria, was to be married to Miss Mara Marchetti, of the Marchetti estate. The province read it, and talked about it, and disagreed about it, and the disagreements were passionate and complex, and had very little to do with either of the people they were about. That same night, when the note had already been sealed and sent and the arrangement was public and irreversible, a carriage left the Marchetti estate quietly, with no announcement and no ceremony, in the direction of the town to the east. It carried Alessia Marchetti, one trunk, and a small bag she had packed herself. No one came to stop her. In the back room with the smoking fireplace, Mara sat at her desk with a new book and an ink-stained thumb, and let her sister go toward whatever she was going toward, and trusted that the going was at least honest, which was more than most departures could claim. Outside, the November dark was full and complete, and the road to the east was empty and quiet. The wedding happened on a Thursday in January. It was nothing the kingdom expected. There was no grand cathedral ceremony with the families of 3 provinces arranged in rows and the women in silk and the men comparing estates in whispers. It was a small church in the provincial town, the same church where the winter collections were held, where the school children came on feast days, where the pews had been repaired so many times the wood was 3 different colors. 50 people attended. Mara wore a blue dress the color of winter sky that she had chosen herself, without consulting her mother, who had opinions about it that she delivered clearly, and then accepted. The flowers were white and simple. Eduardo stood at the front of the church with his son Oliver beside him, and Oliver was 11 years old and held himself with the careful dignity of a boy trying to do the right thing in a situation he had been given very little time to understand. Mara noticed him before she noticed anything else. She noticed the way he stood slightly too straight, the way boys stand when they are working hard at something, and she filed it away the way she filed everything, not to use, just to know. The ceremony was short and correct, and at the end of it, Mara was the Duchess of Valoria, which was a sentence she had not, until approximately 2 months before, ever expected to be true. The kingdom received the news of the marriage with the energetic interest it had been showing the entire affair, which was to say that the people who found it romantic found it more so, and the people who found it suspicious found new reasons for suspicion, and the people who had initially pitied Alessia now divided sharply on the question of whether Alessia was the tragic figure in this story, or whether she had, in fact, escaped something. The last group was the most interesting and the least public about its opinion. Mara was aware of all of it. She had always been aware of all of it. What changed after the wedding was that she had a house with a library the size of the entire Marchetti estate's ground floor, a position that gave her standing she had not previously possessed, and a husband who came home in the evening and said what he actually thought and argued with her about provincial policy with the focused attention of someone who genuinely wanted to be answered. She also had Oliver. Oliver was the part she had not planned for, not because she had not thought about him, she had, but because the reality of him was different from the idea. The reality was a boy who had lost his mother at 7 and had spent 4 years in the care of tutors and house staff while his father worked through grief and professional obligation, and the long, slow process of becoming someone capable of being present again. The reality was a boy who was quietly, systematically testing her, not with cruelty, but with the careful logic of someone who has been left before and is gathering evidence about whether this new thing will hold. She did not try to replace his mother. She did not try to be warm in the performative way that adults perform warmth for children who have been hurt. She simply told him, on the 3rd day, that she had a translation project she was working on, and that the Eastern Territories' history was very interesting, and that if he wanted to come and work on his own things in the same room, she would not be bothered. She left the invitation exactly there and did not repeat it. He came the next morning. He brought a book about horses. They worked in the same room in silence for 2 hours, and at the end of it he said, without looking up, "Do you know much about the Eastern Territories?" "Quite a lot," Mara said, also without looking up. "More than the tutors?" "In some areas," she said, "not all. I don't know much about cavalry formation, which is probably where they would beat me." Oliver considered this. "I don't know about cavalry formation either," he said. "Then we're equally ignorant," Mara said. She heard him, very quietly, almost to himself, make a sound that was almost a laugh. 6 weeks after the wedding, Mara presented a formal petition to the regional council. It was not impulsive. She had been preparing it, in fragments and drafts, for longer than she had been preparing for the marriage itself. The petition concerned the inheritance laws that governed property transfer in the province, specifically the provisions that made a woman's property automatically her husband's upon marriage, that barred daughters from inheriting estates in the presence of male relatives however distant, and that gave women almost no standing in property disputes regardless of the origin of the assets. The laws were old. They had been old when her grandmother was born. They had shaped, without anyone deciding to say so plainly, the particular desperation of families like the Marchettis, houses that mortgaged daughters like assets because daughters were, under the law, exactly that. Mara had lived with these laws her whole life. She had felt them in the way the family talked about Alessia's future, in the way the borrowed silver was on the sideboard when Eduardo arrived, in the way her mother's face had looked holding the note that said she had been chosen, relief and calculation wearing the same expression. She walked into the regional council chamber on a Tuesday morning in March, which was a day the council met routinely to discuss grain taxes and road maintenance, and she sat down in a chair at the long table and presented the petition in a voice that was exactly as calm and level as she intended it to be. The room was not prepared for her. This was partly because she was a woman, and women did not sit at the council table. It was partly because she was a duchess, and duchesses did not sit at council tables either. They appeared at dinners and ceremonies and were given the correct forms of address, and were not expected to have prepared petitions about inheritance law. And it was partly because the petition itself was thorough. It cited precedent from 2 other provinces. It included specific case examples, anonymized, of families whose women had been left without legal protection after a husband's death. It was the work of someone who had been reading and thinking for years, and had finally arrived at a position with enough standing to say the thing clearly. The council sat in a silence that had several layers to it. Eduardo was in the chamber. He had arranged to be there and had said nothing to Mara about it, which she discovered when she looked up from the petition, and found him sitting at the side of the room with his hands folded, and an expression on his face that she was learning to read as deep attention. The council's first response was the one she had expected, which was that this was not a proper matter for the council at this time. Their second response, when she did not move, was that this was not a matter within the council's jurisdiction. Their third response, when she laid out the specific jurisdictional articles that said otherwise, was a silence that was less comfortable than the previous silences had been. One of the council members, an older man named Gerald Hartley, who had the look of someone who had made a career of delaying things efficiently, said, in a voice carefully balanced between courtesy and dismissal, that he appreciated the passion of the petition, but that the council would need considerable time to review any document of this nature. "How much time?" Mara said. "Considerable time," Hartley said. "That is not a unit of measurement," Mara said. Several council members looked at their hands. Eduardo, at the side of the room, kept his expression completely still. Mara could see the near smile that was not quite a smile, and it helped. The council agreed to review the petition, for it agreed to schedule a formal session. It agreed, with the careful vagueness of people who have learned that agreeing and acting are very different things, to take the matter seriously. Mara left the chamber with the petition registered and dated and in the hands of the council secretary, which was more than she had walked in with. Outside the chamber, Eduardo fell into step beside her. Gerald Hartley looked like a man who sat on a pin, he said. He looked like a man who has made a great deal of money from the way things are, Mara said, which is why he will fight this. He'll fight this, Eduardo agreed. And he'll lose. Eventually, Mara said. She was not in the habit of claiming victories before they were real. Eventually, he agreed. They walked. The March air was cold and damp and not particularly welcoming, but the town around them was alive. Carts and voices, and the sound of the market 2 streets over. And Mara moved through it, the way she had always moved through things, steadily, at her own pace, not hurrying. Oliver asked me this morning to teach him about the Eastern Territories petition structure, she said. Eduardo turned to look at her. Did he? He has apparently been listening to more of our evenings than we realized, she said. Eduardo walked a few more paces. How did you respond? I told him to come to the library after his afternoon lesson, she said. I told him I would show him how a petition is built from evidence rather than emotion, and that this is a skill no tutor would have thought to give him and which I happen to have. Eduardo was quiet for a moment, then he said, carefully, How did that land? He wrote it down, Mara said. Eduardo looked at her for a long moment. The streets moved around them, ordinary and full of the small noise of daily life. Mara, he said. She looked at him. Thank you, he said. It was simple, and it was not about the petition. She did not say you're welcome, because the words felt too small. Instead, she turned back to the street ahead of them and kept walking, and he fell back into step beside her, and neither of them felt the need to say anything more about it. The petition failed at the formal session 8 weeks later. It failed by 4 votes. The council, in a majority ruling, decided that the proposed reforms exceeded the regional council's authority and would require a provincial assembly, which would require a different kind of petition, which would require time. Mara sat in the chamber and heard the ruling, and she did not visibly react. She thanked the council for its consideration, and she collected her papers. She left the chamber with Eduardo and Oliver, who had been allowed to come as an observer, and who walked out beside them in a silence that was trying very hard to understand what defeat felt like and whether it was final. Will you try again? Oliver said when they reached the street. Yes, Mara said. When? When I've reviewed which arguments didn't work and why, she said, and when I've found the right person to file it through the provincial assembly instead. It will take longer. The arguments will need to be stronger. But the reasons the petition matters have not changed because 4 men voted against it. Oliver walked quietly for a moment. Gerald Hartley voted against it, he said. He had been paying close attention. He did, Mara said. Was he the worst one? He was the most convinced he was right, Mara said, which is different from worst. The most convinced people are usually the hardest to move and the most important to reach. I'll be spending some time thinking about Gerald Hartley. Oliver considered this. That sounds exhausting, he said. It is, Mara said. It is also necessary. Oliver walked the rest of the way to the carriage in a silence that had shifted in texture. It was the silence of someone putting something away, in a place they intend to return to. Mara recognized it because it was her own. That evening, in the library, after Oliver had gone to bed and Eduardo had the papers from the estate review spread across the other half of the large desk, Mara began drafting the first notes for the second petition. She wrote without hurry, without drama, with the same ink-stained steadiness that she had brought to every piece of work she had ever done in the back rooms and side rooms of a life that had not, for a very long time, offered her a room of her own. Eduardo looked up at her across the desk, and looked at her without speaking, and she looked back at him for a moment, and what passed between them in the lamplight was nothing the province could have written a story about. It was too ordinary, too real, too much like the inside of an actual life rather than the outside of one. He went back to his papers. She went back to her notes. The fire burned and the night was quiet. One of the 4 men who had voted against the petition sent a letter 3 days later. It arrived without warning, sealed with plain wax, no crest. Inside, in careful handwriting, it said that he had questions about the provincial assembly process, and that he wondered whether Miss Duchess Conti might be willing to discuss them. Mara read the letter at the breakfast table, then set it beside her cup. Gerald Hartley, Eduardo said without looking up from his own correspondence. No, Mara said. Someone more interesting. She reached for her pen. 4 days after she sent her reply, a carriage arrived at the estate that Mara did not recognize. It was not Eduardo's. It was not a council carriage. It was smaller, older. The kind of carriage that belongs to someone who has money enough for a carriage and not enough to make it a statement. Mara watched it come up the drive from the library window and thought, with the practical clarity that had served her all her life, that it was too soon to be whatever she had expected, and therefore would be something else entirely. It was Alessia. She came in out of the cold without ceremony, and the woman who crossed the threshold of the Conti estate was not the woman who had left the Marchetti estate in a carriage in November. She was the same age. She had the same face. But something in the way she carried herself had shifted, quietly but completely, the way a house shifts after a storm. The foundations the same, the interior rearranged. Behind her, carrying the second bag, was a man Mara had never met. He was perhaps 30, plainly dressed, with careful hands and the look of someone who did precise work and did not apologize for it. He was not handsome in the polished way that the word usually meant. He was the kind of man whose face became more interesting the longer you looked at it. "This is Henry," Alessia said, to Mara, in the entrance. "Henry Bridwell, he's an accountant." "I know," Mara said. "Well, I knew there was someone. I didn't know his name." "I'm sorry I didn't tell you," Alessia said. "I know why you didn't," Mara said. Henry Bridwell stood slightly behind Alessia, with the air of a man who is aware he is standing in a significant moment and is committed to not making it worse by saying something. "Come in out of the cold," Mara said. "Both of you, we'll have tea and you can tell me what happened, and then we can figure out what comes next." What had happened was not simple, and was not tragic, and was not the story the province had been telling about Alessia Marchetti for the past several months. What had happened was that Alessia had known Henry Bridwell for 2 years before the Duke's carriage arrived, had kept it from her family with the thoroughness of someone who has learned that the things they love will be managed or dismissed, or pointed at and used as evidence of some failing if they are brought into the light too soon. She had kept it from Mara too, which was the part that sat between them in the parlor with the tea things, unresolved. "I was afraid you'd tell Mother," Alessia said. "I might have," Mara said. "I don't know. You didn't give me the chance to decide." "I know," Alessia said. "And the letter," Mara said. "The letter," Alessia said. She looked at her hands. "I know I don't have a defense for it. I have an explanation, which is different." "I know the difference," Mara said. "Give me the explanation." "I was watching everything I thought was mine walk toward you," Alessia said quietly, "and I panicked. And when I panic, I reach for the only tools I have, and the only tool I had was information, and I used it in the worst possible way. And I have thought about it every day since, and I will keep thinking about it." Mara set down her cup. "Is that it?" "That's it," Alessia said. "I'm not going to dress it up." Mara looked at her sister across the tea table. The fire was good in this room, a proper fire and a proper grate, unlike the smoking fireplace in the back room of the Marchetti estate, and the warmth of it was even and generous. "Henry," Mara said, turning to the man who had been sitting very correctly through all of this, "do you understand what my sister did and why it was wrong?" Henry Bridwell looked at her with the direct gaze of someone who respects the question. "Yes," he said. "She was frightened, and she hurt someone she loves, and she knows it." "And?" Mara said. "And it's not the kind of thing I'd want her to do again," he said, "which I told her, at the time." Mara looked at him for a long moment, then she looked at Alessia. "I like him," she said. "Don't lose him." Something in Alessia's face came apart at the seams in the most quiet way. Not dramatically, just a long, held-together thing letting go. The three of them had tea, then Eduardo came home and introductions were made, and Oliver arrived from his afternoon lesson and was given the news of an aunt he did not previously have, and took it with the serious consideration he gave to all new information. Dinner was made for 5 instead of 3, and it was the kind of dinner that is too loud and too crowded and runs well past the right hour, and is, in all the ways that matter, exactly right. The Marchetti estate was sold the following spring. Their mother, whose name was Eleanor and who had spent 30 years being the wife of a man who spent money faster than the estate could make it, and then the widow of that man for 12 years after, made the decision without consulting either daughter, and informed them both by letter on the same morning. The letter was in Eleanor Marchetti's handwriting, the sharp, practical script of a woman who had been raised with elegant penmanship as a requirement, and had never, in 60 years, had the time to make it anything other than efficient. The beacon went off at 07:43 station time, and every single screen in my office lit up at the same moment, and that the sensible thing was to sell it before it sold them, and that she had arranged to take a small house in the town where Alessia and Henry lived, and that she would be within walking distance of the market, and within comfortable driving distance of a daughter who was a duchess, and a daughter who was married to a very capable accountant, and that she found this arrangement entirely satisfactory, and intended to enjoy it thoroughly. Mara read the letter at the breakfast table and felt something loosen in her chest that she had not known was held tight. Eduardo, across the table, said, "Good for her." "Yes," Mara said. "Exactly." Oliver, who had been listening while pretending to eat his toast, said, "Will she visit?" "Often," Mara said. "Good," Oliver said. "She knows a lot about the old province. She told me things last time that aren't in any of the books." Mara looked at him. He was 12 now, and the careful dignity posture of the child trying hard to do the right thing had softened, not into carelessness, but into something more natural. He sat at their table the way a person sits at a table that is theirs. She had not noticed when that had changed. She had just noticed one day that it had. The second petition was filed in July, through the Provincial Assembly, with 11 noble families as co-signatories. Mara had spent 4 months building the list, not by asking favors, not by leveraging Eduardo's position, but by meeting individually with people who had reasons to care, and listening to what those reasons were, and building an argument that held their reasons inside it, alongside her own. The work was slow and unglamorous and deeply satisfying, in the way that only precise, unglamorous work can be. Gerald Hartley signed it. He was the 11th signatory, the last to come, and his coming was the result of 3 long meetings over 2 months, in which Mara had listened more than she spoke, had acknowledged every legitimate concern he raised without dismissing any of them, and had shown him, in concrete and specific terms, what the current law had cost the families in his own county over the past 20 years. She had brought the numbers. She had let the numbers do the work. He had read them in silence. Then he had looked at her across his desk and said, "You are a very inconvenient person, Duchess." "I know," Mara said. "I've been told." "My wife," he said, "lost the house her father built when his brother contested the estate. The brother won, because the law said he should." Mara said nothing. She let him finish. "She has not talked about it in 30 years, he said. "Not to me, not to anyone. A great many women have not talked about a great many things for a very long time," Mara said. "That's the problem we're trying to fix." Hartley signed the petition the following Monday. The assembly session was in September, and Mara attended it with her notes and her petition, and Eduardo at her side, and Oliver in the back row of the observers' gallery, where he had asked to be positioned so he could see the full chamber. She presented the case in a voice that was the same voice she had always used for difficult truths. Level, unhurried, giving nothing away and saying everything precisely. The vote was 14-6. It passed. The law that passed was not the law she had written. It was narrower and partial, and had been amended 6 times, and the amendments had softened 3 of the most important provisions. It was imperfect in ways that were specific and frustrating, and that she had catalogued carefully, because she already knew they would become the basis of the next thing, the follow-on work, the long project of which this was one step. She received the news in the middle of breakfast, from a note delivered by the Assembly Secretary's office, 2 days after the session. Eduardo was across the table. Oliver was running slightly late because he had stayed up past his hour reading the Eastern Territories volume, and she had not stopped him because the reading mattered more than the hour. She read the note. She set it beside her cup. She picked up her coffee. "It passed?" Eduardo said. "It passed," she said. "Narrower than what you wrote," he said. He had read all the drafts. "Yes," she said. "Narrower than what I wrote. Stronger than what existed. It's a beginning." She drank her coffee. Oliver arrived at the table 6 minutes later, with his hair not quite right, and his books under his arm, and he dropped into his chair, and looked at Mara, and read her face, the way he had been learning to read her face for almost a year and a half. "Something happened," he said. "The petition passed," she said. He was quiet for a moment, then, "The amended version or the original?" "The amended version," she said. He thought about this. "Is the amended version better or worse than nothing?" "Better," she said, significantly. "Then it's good," he said. "Yes," she said, "it's good." He pulled his book toward him and opened it and began to eat his toast without further ceremony, because he was his father's son in at least this one way. He knew when a thing was settled and he did not revisit what was already decided. That afternoon, Mara received a letter from Philippa, who had been following the entire proceeding from 2 miles down the road with the careful attention of someone who has been a loyal friend through enough years to have earned the right to say "I told you so," and is too good a person to say it. The letter said, "Congratulations, you inconvenient, magnificent person." Mara wrote back, "Don't get sentimental, there's still the property dispute provision." Philippa wrote back, "I know, I'm bringing cake on Thursday anyway." In the library that evening, which had become the room where most of the real things happened in the Conti household, The arguments, the work, the silences that were not empty, the conversations that mattered. Mara was at the desk with the follow-on notes, and Eduardo was on the other side of it with the estate accounts. And the fire was good, and the lamp was good, and Oliver had come in after his lesson and was reading on the window seat with the horsebook replaced now by a volume on provincial assembly procedure that he had taken from the shelf 3 weeks ago and not returned. At some point, Eduardo looked up and said, not quite to anyone in particular, "Are you happy?" Oliver looked up from the window seat. Mara looked up from the desk. "That's a very large question," Mara said. "I know," Eduardo said. She thought about it with the same seriousness she gave to questions worth taking seriously. The fire burned. Outside the window, the September evening was settling into dark. "I don't know if happy is exactly the word," she said. "I'm exactly where I want to be, doing exactly the work I believe in, with people I trust. That's not the same as happy, which sounds temporary. This sounds like something I could keep." Eduardo looked at her across the desk in the lamplight. "Good," he said. "You?" she said. "Yes," he said. "Yes," he said, without qualification, without elaboration. Oliver, from the window seat, said nothing, because he had learned, from both of them, from the long evenings in this room, from the way they talked and argued and sat in silence and meant it, that some things didn't need commentary. They just needed to be true. He went back to his book. Mara went back to her notes. Eduardo went back to the accounts. The fire burned on and the library was warm, and the evening outside was full of the ordinary quiet of a household that had found, without planning to, the particular shape of a life that fits. It was not the story the province told. The province's version was romantic and dramatic and had a clear beginning, middle, and end, and gave everyone a role that made sense in the telling. The real version was this: a woman who had stopped expecting anything was given a morning, and then another morning, and then a year and a half of mornings, and she had spent each one doing the work she believed in with the people she trusted, and had won some things and lost some things, and was currently planning the next round of the things she had not yet won. She would not have called it a love story, because love stories end. She would have called it a choice, made once in a cold November garden and then made again, in smaller ways, every single day after. That is how it works when it is real. That is what it looks like from the inside.